Thank you for joining for this episode of the TechSpective podcast. My guest for this episode is Maggie MacAlpine. So Maggie, if you want to give a little bit of background on yourself.
Sure. Hi, Tony. So I'm Maggie McAlpine. I am currently the cyber engagement lead at MITRE Engenuity's Center for Threat-Informed Defense. So I'm the person who's hopefully reaching out to the community, getting their feedback, and helping it inform our future projects. It's a really great organization. I'm excited to be there.
Awesome. Just by way of a little bit of background. So I've known you for a while. I mean, you and I previously worked together at Cybereason, but even before that, you were on a panel that I had covered, and I think it was related to your background with election security. And things like that. So we've been in the same circles for a while. But I also, MITRE. I have tremendous respect for MITRE. I think most of the industry has tremendous respect for MITRE. So I think that's a great place to be. And congrats.
Thanks. Yeah, it's exciting. Pretty exciting to be here.
So. I guess my first question is sort of what's the, if you can help me understand, like what's the distinction between like MITRE and the MITRE Engenuity side of things? Sure.
So MITRE, as a lot of people know, is like a 60-year-old, government nonprofit, very serious, like works with all the government agencies. Some point in the last few years, they spun off MITRE Engenuity with the mission to work more with for-profit. So it's going to be a little less like tightly restricted on its movements. It's going to be more outreach to private industry and more partnership there. And things like MITRE ATT&CK and whatnot fall under MITRE Engenuity and in that sort of interest of partnering and working with private industry.
Okay. MITRE ATT&CK also is, I think, something that I think most people have a pretty good level of respect for. I mean, I look forward to seeing the results every year. The one thing that I think comes up every year, and I wrote about it when it happened this year, is just the spin. Like MITRE has taken a position of, hey, we're sharing raw data, we're not declaring a winner, etc. And it's like, okay, that's great, that makes sense on some level. But the vendors who participate very much try to declare a winner. And as soon as the results come out, it's someone's going, we're number one in MITRE, and it's like, well, no, you're number one in MITRE in this specific category for this specific test. I mean, you're very much cherry picking the results here at this point, which I think just makes it harder for customer, like the market in general, like who's trying to like get some benefit from the MITRE results to like, okay, well, if I look at 10 different vendors, I'm going to get sort of 10 different answers on what the MITRE results mean.
Absolutely. I mean, I will say, first of all, that it's not Gartner, right? It's like it's not, or Forrester or something. It's not ranking people and things like that. But I will say that there's actually, like, within MITRE Engenuity quite a few like smaller organizations even there, and one of them is the MITRE ATT&CK evaluations team, which are some fantastic people I've had the chance to work with. But we're actually like a separate team over in the Center for Threat-Informed Defense. So we sort of field this all the time, and we like try to make sure people find the right people. But the Center for Threat-Informed Defense and their projects is more about like creating tools for MITRE ATT&CK. So, we created a web browser tool not too long ago that allows you to like quickly look up MITRE ATT&CK terminology, or we created like an ecosystem of like MITRE ATT&CK data called the Sightings Ecosystem, which is like even now calling for contributors of data, which like gets you access to this MITRE ATT&CK, styled pool of attack data, right? But all of these like tools, it's almost like I sort of joked, it's almost like the Minecraft mod store for MITRE ATT&CK, if you're familiar with that kind of terminology. And that's like what the center does, is try to come up with these projects that will serve people who are using MITRE ATT&CK and who are interacting with all of this and who are defenders in the industry. But it is not the same as the evaluations team, who have like a totally different mission.
Okay, well. But it sounds like that's exceptionally helpful. I mean, so aside from the part that I just described of end customers in the market, having to kind of struggle to figure out, okay, well, what do these results mean? Regardless of how that all, filters out, it sounds like, the kind of tools you're talking about would be very helpful. And I will also say, just, real quick again on MITRE ATT&CK, that, one of the other challenges I think there is with that is just that it's not, there's no one size fits all. So even if a vendor, is like, well, we're number one, it's like, okay, well, you're number one, but based on a number of factors and criteria that might or might not exist in my environment. I mean, there are a number of variables to consider. And just because someone was number one in one way doesn't necessarily mean they're number one in your environment.
Sure. I mean, I guess that's why people really need to go back to the data sometimes, because sometimes I imagine those categories are fairly niche, like, and you just need to know what that category was, that they got that ranking in, and then it's properly represented, of course.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that is the primary takeaway is always just go look at the data for yourself. It's just that not everyone, I think a lot of people maybe aren't at the level where they fully understand what it is they're looking at. And so they kind of want someone else to interpret it for them. But then you're open to the bias of the interpreter.
Absolutely. And, maybe that's the point where you go and you talk to your internal team, or if you're the person who has the decision-making power. I don't know if I would say hire a consultant, but maybe I'd even say the opposite of that. But, it's always important to do your homework and dig in to what that is.
Yeah. All right. Well, so, is there anything ongoing, upcoming, that you guys are working on that you can talk about?
Yes, absolutely. So at any given point, the center has actually got its 20th anniversary, but not of years, of 20th project anniversary, 20 projects coming up very soon. And we're going to be celebrating that and deep diving into that with some content coming out soon. But at any given point, we have like 2 to 3 projects that are kind of in the pipe, and we are always working with the sponsors or with the community to try to figure out new ones. There's just like a constant wish list of things that could be coming out. But right now we are working on soliciting data contributors for something called the Sightings Ecosystem. And coming as I was from the vendor space, this was actually one of the projects I got most excited about first, because it seemed just so applicable. And it's basically it is somewhat what the title says, which is a collection of adversary behavior that's being, gathered in one place from multiple contributors. What I like about MITRE being perhaps the repository of this is, of course, that they're a nonprofit, and then they're not vendor specific. If a vendor hosted it, they'd probably focus on things that they can address, or they could go bankrupt, or they could just decide one day that they're going to monetize it instead of having it be free. So it's kind of like this open source database they're trying to put together open source. If you join, you can get the data out. I think you can get some summaries out, but you got to get the full thing, you got to, contribute. Of this sort of raw sightings data that is of specific adversary TTPs that are being mapped to attack, anonymized and aggregated to produce this intelligence, describing insights from that data. So they've got till I think the next couple of months. They're soliciting more people to join that program, and I think that is just one of the cooler things that we're working on and what I'm really excited about.
Well, okay, and it sounds exciting to me as well, if I'm understanding it properly, because it sounds like something I've been I've talked about for 5 or 10 years, which is so going back to, what was it, Operation Night Dragon? Was that the Google China?
What year was that? What year would that have been?
It was like 2012, I want to say. But it was when it was like Google was, Google announced that they had been, hacked on some level. It was attributed to threat actors in China. I always sort of frame it that way. It's like, well, I'm not going to say it was China directly necessarily, although I think that the distinction is semantic. But when they released that information, at the time, a number of other companies all of a sudden came out and said, hey, you know what, we were seeing that stuff too. We also had that happen. However, everyone, it's just the kind of the mindset of security. Everyone wanted to keep it secret. So everyone knew they were being hacked, but they didn't want to talk about it until Google went public. And then all of a sudden everyone came out of the woodwork and was like, oh yeah, we saw that too. And then they could kind of like put all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle on the table and look at it together and go, okay, well now we really understand, you guys saw this, but we saw this. And now if we put the whole piece together, now we can understand how this whole thing happened, how it worked. And, and I had a conversation, he was at McAfee still at the time, but I had a conversation with George Kurtz around that time about that. And we talked about how valuable that was, that, the idea of having, having the data on the TTPs and the attacks that you're seeing live, and being able to share that information would be very valuable. And I think a number of vendors sort of position themselves as having that, but still within their own proprietary bubble. Like it's like if you're McAfee doesn't really exist anymore, Trellix now, but but if you're McAfee and you say, oh well, we have customers around the world, and so we have all of this sensor data and all of these inputs, and so if there's an attack going on in Australia, we know about it, and we can share that information across our ecosystem with our other customers. And it's like, okay, well, that's great within the McAfee ecosystem. Same thing for CrowdStrike. Same thing for Tenable. Whoever. Everyone has their own like proprietary bubble of information that they're aggregating and sharing with their own customers. But I've advocated, like I said, for the last 10 years for something more along these lines of saying, well, okay, but let's take the bubbles away and share that information, because I think that as a cybersecurity, as an industry, it's my opinion that we all have an obligation to work together to solve the problem. And how you differentiate yourself in the market, if you're CrowdStrike, if you're Tenable, if you're Cybereason, it should be something else. Like you can differentiate yourself in the market based on how you solve the problem or whatever. But I think this sort of sharing of information that is necessary for everyone to understand what the problem even is should be the de facto, like that should just be the way it works.
Yeah, ideally. And I mean, that's kind of been a philosophical core to the tech community as long as I've known it, with things like open source. But I think it's also worth noting that the one thing that, again, made me excited about Sightings Ecosystem is it doesn't necessarily negate the possibility of those customer, centric alerts and like that bespoke, like we're going to let you know about the things you need to worry about. Because actually, what if somebody like a Cybereason or a CrowdStrike joined the Sightings Ecosystem, they would also, in theory, get data. They would actually, not in theory, in practice, get access to the data of a CrowdStrike or a Cybereason or somebody else who came in, and then they could, actually pool that knowledge in a nonprofit third party, not going to favor anybody, and you can actually take that information out and back with you to serve your customers. So you're actually getting, you're going to get a larger pool of data available to you, which to actually work with. And the real goal of this, I think, too, is to kind of cut through some, let me get to that in a second. But first, like, you will maybe find in that data things that you are uniquely suited at addressing. And you'll be able to promote with that. You'll be able to say, hey, we're part of this, what's the word? I'm like nonpartisan, sort of group with this sightings data. And look, the thing that we address best is number one right now. And you don't even have to trust us on it, because obviously we're going to say that we're a vendor, but like this MITRE thing, this MITRE ecosystem actually is saying that the thing we address is number one threat right now. So you could take that back home with you to work with. And more importantly, it's also trying to cut through this noise. It's, there is the sort of like, it's nothing but SolarWinds one week. It's nothing but Colonial one week. It's nothing. And those are actually really important attacks. Those are really important things to know about. But I can imagine if you're a small, the single defender of a small company or something like that, like you're not seeing, these like these hyper specific, like defense industry targeted, like APT groups coming after you. You're not getting targeted with espionage stuff that might make the news. news. You're getting, maybe there's some old ransomware type or something that's just, you're just getting hit with all of the time, and like, but you don't know that other people are too. So it's also kind of meant to cut through that noise and actually look at what threats are really happening, even if they're not sexy.
Right. Well, and you know, I sort of alluded to the jigsaw puzzle analogy, but I've used that a number of times because I'm like, okay, you know, CrowdStrike has a set of pieces, Tenable has a set of pieces, Cybereason has a set of pieces. Customers who are being hit by these attacks have a set of pieces. It's just that nobody really knows what the puzzle is supposed to look like. You know, it's like when you're doing a jigsaw puzzle, you've got the box there in front of you, so you can look at the cover, you look at the lid, and understand what's the you know, the end result supposed to look like, so you can try to match the pieces up with where they belong on the picture. But if I just give you 10 random puzzle pieces and say, here, go, you've got nothing to work with. And that's why I think, you know, something like this is valuable. It's like, well, you need everyone to pool all the pieces together, you know, so that you can try to figure out what that larger picture looks like. And, you know, to the point you were just making about, you know, maybe it shows that, you know, the thing that's number one on the list of being, you know of attacks right now is the one thing that you're good at. I think that's also another one of the reasons that it's so valuable to share the information is, you know, within cybersecurity, and I mean, probably within, you know, lots of industries, but because I'm in cybersecurity, it's what I see. There's a lot of the philosophy of when you're a hammer, everything is a nail. And, you know, so an endpoint protection company is viewing things from that perspective, and they're, you know, they're going to see the problem from that perspective, and they're going to provide answers from that perspective, which is going to be different than, you know, a vulnerability management company, which is going to be different than an intrusion detection company. It's like, so they're all looking at it differently. And even if they're looking at the same thing, they're going to interpret it differently. And the way that attacks have evolved, you know, so, you know, once upon a time, maybe that was okay. But I think, you know, attackers continue to get smarter, and they you know, the more sophisticated attackers understand what the endpoint protection is looking for. They understand what the intrusion detection is looking for. They understand what, you know, all of these tools are going to detect. And, you know, so they obviously work to stay under that radar. Like there's like, I can go right up to this threshold, and I don't want to cross it because I'm gonna flag something. And so you break the attack up over different pieces. You're like, I'll do a little bit over here, I'll do a little bit over there, and I'll do all of it just to stay just under the radar. But then when you put it all together, you know, now you're compromised.
Yeah, I mean, the attackers are, in a funny way, they're almost like our industry, you know, they're in our industry too, so to speak, because they, you know, as we saw in the Conti leaks, like they have their own office buildings, they have their own HR, they have their own way of doing things, and they're all professionals. They're just professionals on the dark side, and they're absolutely systematic, and they're as professional and as, you know, careful as anyone may be on the defender side. And they're absolutely looking at what we're talking about. They're looking at what we're aware of, and they're going to try to break it up, and they're going to try to fly under the radar, and they're going to try to get, if they're, you know, a money focused group versus like an espionage group, like if you're a ransomware group, you're going to go for as much money as you can, and that's going to involve really knowing the landscape and knowing your targets and what your targets are concerned about. So I absolutely believe they have, you know, eyes, and they're sharing information, you know, as well, just as we should be doing more.
Right, probably. And yeah, I mean, it you know, we talked, you know, we covered that a lot, you know, at Cybereason, but it's yeah, that the fact that they have basically the, you know, mirror image of the ecosystem, that there is, you know, there is HR. They're like, you know, a lot of the things that, you know, like with ransomware, it's like, well, the ransomware, you know, you've got one group who's actually writing the ransomware exploit, then they're offering that as a service. Somebody else is contracting that service. Some other third party is managing the payment processing. Like, yeah, that's not typically an in-house thing. It's like there's this whole ecosystem going on. And yeah, and when you were talking, it also reminded me that you know, a lot of what any company does is competitive intel. You know, like you try to actually get the platform or tools of your competitor, so you can have someone really get in and figure out, okay, exactly how does this work? What are they doing that we're not? What are we better at than them? And and you do that kind of competitive intel on your rivals. I imagine they're doing the same. They're buying all the security tools and they're putting them up in test environments so they can figure out how do you get past this.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is something we talked about, as you said, in Cybereason. We talked about it for quite a lot. And when I was in the election security world, you might know I was one of the voting village founders at DEF CON. And we would, for 2 days, hack into voting machines. We'd take them apart, put them back together again, along with the attendees. And at the end, we would always make the point, like, this has only been a 2 or 3 day exercise. If there's an actual, persistent threat out there, if there's an actual group going after these machines or the software or anything affiliated with our elections, they're not spending 2 days on it. They've got a lab somewhere. They're spending hours and days and experts on it. If these attacks are not up to your standard of what you think, is a threat, just keep in mind, this is a bunch of experts in 2 days and not, a dedicated team. And these other, again, going back to the idea, they're professionals and they absolutely would have dedicated teams tearing apart these tools.
I was going to say, I'd almost feel better. No, I definitely would feel better if it was professionals in 2 days. But I don't remember if it was last year or the year before, because they've also invited children to do DEF CON Voting Village, and middle school kids have hacked into these systems in 2 days.
I'm just going to use the opportunity to actually tell the real story there, because it actually was a little bit of a funny pain point for us for a bit. So I think it was 2017, what we had was an affiliated group within DEF CON who was doing a kids hack event, and we helped them out and offered them what basically was a very accurate mock-up of a government website, so a Secretary of State's website, and the kids were able to, using this, again, picture perfect photocopy of how that site was built, get in and change the numbers of the election. So it was, some people complained oh, that's so easy. It's just some numbers on a website. That's just basically, tagging a building, levels of ease. And I understood their point, because when people were hearing election hacking, they always assume it means there was a voting machine involved. But actually hacking an election can be everything from, the Hillary Clinton email hacks could count as an election hack. Anything that would influence people's perception, anything that would, because elections are so multi-part. But
right.
But what I took issue with people saying, well, that doesn't count because it's not a machine, is actually people have died in election protests where the results were changed mid-election. So a riot would break out because you thought your guy was ahead, and then they go, oops, sorry, just kidding, we got hacked and those results are wrong. This is the actual real results and your guy's now losing. That, first of all, would you believe it? If, say, the party in power said that about the person coming in, would you believe that, even if it was true, even if it was a 10-year-old script kiddie who had changed the numbers on the official website? So that was our point. We were like, this is an election hack.
Right. Well, I guess 2 points on that. Number one, I would say, number one, we sort of saw that with 2020 because of the difference between real-time voting and mail-in voting. And, so you see the kind of exit polling tracking all day, it looks a certain way, and all of a sudden, 4 hours later, they count all the mail-in votes and it completely shifts. And now you have half the country who's like, oh, that seems wrong. My guy should have won. And it's like, well, no, they just weren't done counting the votes. It's not, there's no secret conspiracy. They just have to actually count all the votes before you can declare a winner. But to your point about the Secretary of State thing too, I think that very much can influence things. It's part of the reason that I feel like during, as the CNNs and NBCs and Fox Newses of the world are doing their tracking from the break of dawn until the end of the day on election day, I generally feel like it's bad. It's bad for the election process because they do try not to actually declare a winner, but if you're on the West Coast, the East Coast is done voting and you already know who won stuff before you get to the West Coast, and it influences people's willingness to stand in line and their willingness to show up. So if you could change the numbers, or let's just take I'm in Texas. So I wake up on election day essentially knowing that my vote is meaningless. I'm in a red state, and what I think doesn't really matter, and
level. But I will protest. You should pay attention to primaries and local municipal elections too. Those are very important. But please continue.
Well, and so and I do still go vote every time, but I can see where, like, if I woke up and if someone woke up and they just looked at the numbers and the numbers just showed like it was ridiculously skewed one way or the other, then it'd be like, okay, well, either my guy's winning, I don't need to show up, or, oh, my guy's losing so badly, I don't need to show up. And if someone hacked those numbers, if those numbers didn't reflect reality, you're now influencing, the ability, you're influencing the turnout of the election. So even something that simple, like I don't have to actually hack the election machine itself. Mm-hmm. But just on that note, I mean, on the professional side of things, we've shown that that's also possible.
Yes, we've shown that's possible. Elections are an interesting and difficult beast, specifically because the perception of a hack is as damaging as an actual hack. If you just did absolutely nothing but convince people that you had done something, that can constitute an election hack because of the way it would influence opinion. So that was always something we had to be extremely careful with when talking. We had to be very self-disciplined about like not making apocalyptic projections and things like that, and really trying to keep the message on like knowing how someone can die doesn't mean you know how they were murdered. Like we know this thing could kill someone. We're not saying this person was killed this way. And just along those lines, just like not saying, first of all, just being rigorously nonpartisan because it can happen to anyone, and also just acknowledging the fact that a lot of mistakes in elections, actually, like the ones that actually get recounts and things like that, huge percentage of those are accidents. They're just a mistake, human error. They're not malice necessarily. And for malice to actually have an influence in a lot of the ways that people think about, a federal election is probably not where it's going to happen because the numbers are too big. It's really quite hard to. It's the conspiracy a formula, right? Like somebody did a calculation once of how many people would have to be involved for the moon landing to have been faked, and it was like among them the entire population of Russia would have to be in on it. And not spill. So it's kind of similar like that with elections as far as like say voter fraud or something like that. The number of people who would have to be involved to individually swing ballots towards a change is pretty untenable in a federal election. It might work in like a local dog catcher type thing or like a really small election or something with a very tight margin in a small election. But you just need to be aware of these things too. And almost always we've seen that the true outcome or true reason behind anything quote unquote fishy is some sort of machine or human error. So it's always just don't ascribe to malice what stupidity will
that's very true. And I think it's always been a little frustrating to me as someone who's very interested in the political side of things, but also works in cybersecurity, because on the one hand, I'm like, okay, why does this have to be so complicated? Why can't I just vote from my phone? Why can't I just show up and hit a button? Like, why can't we just do this electronically? It would take like 4 seconds to add up the votes. And then I put my cybersecurity hat on. I'm like, oh, that's why.
Endpoint security. How are you going to secure everybody's phone and their computer? How are you going to make sure that everybody's device that they vote from is not already corrupted in some way or going to be corrupted en route? So the problems just multiply, and that's why internet voting doesn't work. Honestly, mail-in voting accomplishes almost everything that people want internet voting to do, but much more safely and much more provably. Could you imagine trying to do a recount if we'd had digital, like only digital records in any of those disputed elections? Oh my God, you can just,
right. And I've given some thought to that, because I'm like, okay, so even if, the machines that, well, they just changed them recently, but the machines that we've used here in Harris County in Texas for a while, it's like you'd go in, there's a little dial thing, there's the digital screen, and you'd make all your selections, and at the end it would kind of like print out this thing, and it's like, okay, well, now here's all your answers. And I was always like, all right, well, but how do I know that didn't get changed on the electronic side? Whatever, like there are so many like checks and balances that still need to kind of happen even for something like that. But yeah, I'm all for the mail-in ballots, and I mean I think, you know, as much controversy as it got in 2020, you know, the entire state of Oregon has been doing mail-in ballots for a while, and what's even better about their system is when they send you the ballot, they send you like a whole booklet of, okay, here's the background on the candidates, and here's the ballot issues we're talking about. So now you've got information from which to make a decision as well. Because what happens with most people, and is I go in, I already know who I'm voting for governor, but then you start getting into, okay, Fifth Circuit Court judge, blah blah blah. I'm like, I don't freaking know who these people are. I don't know their records. I don't know who I want. But you're asking me to vote for them. And it's like, and I understand on one level, that's very much my responsibility as a citizen. And my duty as a citizen is to understand, well, who is running and what does that mean and what is their record and who do I want to choose? But it's a lot. Like, and people aren't that invested, in those lower level elections like that. But I think I would be more so if you gave me the booklet and the time to do some research into it. I guess my similar anecdote would be when I joined the Air Force. I took the ASVAB, it's the test they do for, figure out what your aptitudes are and figure out what you're qualified for to do in the military. And, my score came back basic. I don't remember what it was. It was like a 99. And so they were like, all right, you can basically, you can literally do anything, any career in the military, pick one. And they gave me a binder like 5 inches thick and sat me down at a table, and I have a feeling, and I don't know this for sure. I have a feeling if I would have known enough to push back and say, hey, you know what, I'm gonna go home. I need some time to think about this. Can I borrow this book? That maybe that all would have been okay, but that wasn't the sense I got. The sense I got was, hey, can you make this decision in the next 30 minutes? With this 5-inch binder and no other information. And so I kind of flipped through. I'm like, I don't know, that one, I'll do that. That's how I feel on election day a lot of times. It's like, I don't know anything about this, but there's people in line behind me. I need to make a choice.
Yeah, and that sort of is compounding the fact that like every state is different. So, you can have like Oregon system sounds wonderful, and then you have the problem of the fact that like in other places it's a touchscreen machine, so it is a line behind you. And whereas in New Hampshire, where I live, it's a ballot where it's just a paper ballot, so you can go and you can take your time, and they can have like a million booths set up, and then you just feed it into the machine at the end. So every state's different, and every system's different, and we try to steal from each other to make it more better, but every state also has its own priorities.
I recognize, and I'm going to say this, and we'll try and get back to MITRE Engenuity, but I recognize we've gone way off track. Yeah. But that actually is another thing. Like, I personally am opposed to most state sovereignty in those ways, whether it comes to each state gets to choose, each county or whatever gets to choose, well, how they want to run elections. I'm like, well, no, we are all, like, maybe if you want to do that for your own county election, fine, but we are all voting for the president of the United States. This is a federal election. We should all be voting the same way. Like, there shouldn't be a difference between how you do that in Florida versus Oregon versus New Hampshire, in my opinion. Same thing with education system. I'm like, I don't want the education system decided on a county by county, district by district basis. Like, we have decided as a country that education is a thing that we provide K through 12. There should be some standardization of how that happens and how that's funded. And there shouldn't be a, order of magnitude difference in the quality and funding of a school district from one county to the next.
Yeah, I mean, best of luck with that. It is a jealously guarded states, right? And it has its moments. It has its moments when somebody on the federal level does try to have influence over the election. They really can't. because of how jealously guarded of a state's right. So it does serve as its own check and balance, but of course everything has its ups and downs, pros and cons.
A lot of the problems with it are, and it's the same issue with the Electoral College. It's one thing if it's just a thing that we've done that is maybe not working and we want to change it. It's another thing if it's a thing that we've done that's, embedded in the Constitution, because now I have to have an actual constitutional amendment to change that. Like I can't just decide on a whim, like, hey, what if we did this a better way? It has to actually be a constitutional amendment, which is problematic.
Very near impossible. Anyway,
let's go back to MITRE Engenuity. Yeah. Let's go back to the idea of sharing information, sharing intelligence. Like I said, it definitely makes sense to me. So you said you're soliciting organizations to be members, to take part in this. Explain again. The members who are part of it obviously can kind of pull information from this. If an organization is not a member, a contributing member, is there any way to access the information, or is there or is it just you're either in or you're out?
There will be a report, I think, that will, summarize kind of what's found, and it will make that information available. But you won't have like the deep dive into the data and how to disseminate it that I think would be the access given to people who are also contributing.
Right, and just to be clear, I also think that's totally fair. Yeah, like
everyone just wants to eat the bread,
Right. It's like basically, if you're not contributing and you just want to see the data, it's like, well, you're asking for something for nothing. It's like, well, if you're not gonna contribute and play the game, then why should we give you a trophy?
And to be clear too, I mean, vendors have been the example I've brought up because they have maybe a motivation in understanding this data more that maybe is a little bit more direct and A to B. But like the ideal is that it's not just vendors who are sharing this information. We would love to have every sector we can, every industry we can, finance, agriculture, everybody, contributing so that we can actually see like what threats are hitting by industry. What are things that we might not have realized are being used across industries. And that's very hard to do if it's just, narrow vendors. Now, another thing is, though, that if you were worried about anonymizing that data, if you were worried that private stuff would get into that, you could also work with a vendor to contribute it that way. So there are ways to contribute and that are very mindful of anonymity and privacy and things like that. But not to make it sound like it's just meant for cybersecurity vendors. Ideally, someday it'd be wonderful if we just had almost like a weather channel, like a meteorological, almost like central repository of just all these attacks that are happening. Imagine what we could learn and imagine what we could address.
Right. Right. I mean, like I said, that goes back to, I feel like that information should be like that, like it should just be general information. It's like, using that analogy, it's like, the weatherman at ABC doesn't have proprietary information that doesn't exist for the weatherman at NBC. Like, they're sharing the same weather. And I feel like that should be in cybersecurity as well. And then, I guess how you win in the market, how you differentiate is just by hiring the more charismatic weatherman.
Well, also keep in mind that one weatherman can't give the weather that's relevant to every single person in the world. There just aren't enough hours in the day. So, it would also be it would be relevant to the solution that you provide, where we're disseminating this data for you if you're worried about ransomware or endpoints or things like that. Or we're also maybe we're noticing that this particular geographical location, this particular sector is getting particularly hit right now. And you might see that somewhere in that 100-page report or whatever it's going to be. But you might still need somebody who's a little closer to your issue to really grok all of that and to really put it into terms that are timely and useful to you. Right.
Well, and I appreciate that there have been more. It seems like there have been an increasing volume of these types of cooperation. I mean, you have all the ISACs and things, so you have industry specific, kind of coalitions of sharing information, for that industry segment. But there's also been, I think, a lot more, especially under the Biden administration. There's been a lot more kind of public-private type coalitions, a lot more, kind of bringing everyone to the table to figure out, okay, well, how can we address this threat together?
Especially with, that's because a lot of industries are going to be on the front lines if an attack happens, of some kind. We saw it particularly with the Ukraine conflict when that kicked off. There was a lot of solicitation from the government to the private sector with that in mind, the fact that the private industries were going to be possibly the first who were going to spot the early signs of any kind of longer term or more serious attack.
Yeah. All right. Well, I wanted to kind of start to wind things down, but also, is there, so obviously that's a big focus. Are there any other things on the horizon, or the things that you want to make mention of that
Sure.
you guys are working on?
I would just note that, we've got a project coming out that was called MITRE Emulations, which was basically allowing you to emulate adversaries using smaller chains, which was kind of interesting. And you can learn more on the website. But there's also this, and this shocked me when I kind of first came to the center, was that there's this entire repository of GitHub tools on GitHub of tools that the center has created in partnership with the sponsors, but it's meant for the public. It is out there for free. And I was, not very many people actually know about these free resources that the center has been putting out. So kind of one of my short-term missions is just being like, hey, there's free stuff, there's useful stuff. It is meant for defenders. It is made by MITRE. It is top-notch work, and it is there, and it's there for your use. And really love to see wider adoption and making everyone's life easier.
All right. Well, definitely good to know, and I'll make sure to include a link. Both from the standpoint of people who can benefit from those tools should know about them, but also, if MITRE is investing the time and effort and resources, if MITRE and the associated community are developing these tools, you want people to get some value out of them.
Absolutely, that's the goal.
So, all right. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to join me. It was great to chat again in our post Cybereason capacities. Yeah, I could talk about election stuff for hours and hours. We could do a whole separate podcast on that.
Separate podcast. I actually, it's worth making my disclaimer now. I am not doing election work at MITRE. I'm not affiliated with that. I'm just continue to be a member of a society and a citizen. So that is, that's my work on elections now. Become a poll worker.
Right. I appreciate it. All right. Take care.
You too. Have a great day.
I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow at TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions you'd like to see answered in future posts.